Welcome to the AASA PDK Decennial Survey podcast series, where we take a look at a variety of issues affecting school system leadership nationwide. During the first episode of this mini-series, CEO of PDK International, Josh Starr, will be speaking with Doctors Gregory Hutchings and Jennifer Cheatham on a conversation about race and equity.
So I want to welcome everybody to our 2020 AASA Decennial podcast series. My name is Josh Starr. I'm the CEO of PDK International, and we worked with AASA this year on the Decennial Survey, which has been going on for, I think, almost like 120 years now. And it's just what we wanted to do in this podcast series is tease out some of the really important and interesting questions that have been raised and talk to some folks who have done the work as superintendents in the field and are leaders in the space to get some more insight and spark some conversation for about half an hour or so. So I'm very, very pleased that for our first podcast guest, we have Dr. Jen Cheatham, former superintendent of Madison, Wisconsin, who's now a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Dr. Greg Hutchings, who's superintendent of schools in Alexandria, Virginia, was also superintendent of schools in Shaker Heights, Ohio. And this week we are starting with one of the easiest subjects there is, race and equity, right? It certainly permeates so much of what we're doing in schools these days. It was clearly evident in the survey this year that it's on people's minds. And I wanted to get together with a couple leaders that I really admire and have seen their careers and their work as they've led some great systems work in addressing race and equity issues, and just kind of have a conversation about the findings and their perspective. So Greg and Jen, welcome to the AASA Decennial podcast series.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Josh. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, really glad you're here. So let's just start with kind of the beginning sort of stuff, right? The obvious stuff. So we have seen a slight uptick in leaders of color in school districts. We've seen a little more in urban areas. We've seen a little more women of color actually are increasing more than men of color. Like, what are you seeing around the country as you work in school districts and with superintendents? What have you seen in your own experience? Like, why isn't it increasing as quickly as we'd like to see, and what should we be doing about this? So let's just start with that.
I think
either one of you can go first.
I say, have you turned on your TV lately? That's the reason why. I mean, look at the race relations and issues we have across the country, and that's why you're not really seeing people of color in this role. We don't get the opportunity to have a seat at the table, and if you don't have people of color at the seat of the table, how are they going to know how to recruit other people of color? So you now have a white dominated group trying to determine how do we get more Black and brown superintendents, and they're not Black or brown. So I think that's really the biggest issue. And I think that, the uptick that we're having, which is now like a little over 9%, a little under 9%, it's still not enough when majority of our public schools across this country are predominantly Black and brown. I think that the race relational issue we're having across this country is probably the number one factor, but that's just my 2 cents. I don't know, Jen, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I'm with you, Greg. I was taught early on as a leader that the most important thing, or one of the most important things you do, is field talented teams in this work. It is something you have to put a lot of work into, right? So I take this approach, like it actually takes work. You don't just post job positions and sit back and wait to see who you get, right? You fill that pool with talented people, and you fill it with people of color, with diversity, with lived and professional experiences that you need to do these jobs well. So I think that your point is well taken, Greg. I think there are too many leaders out there who are sitting back and saying, well, I don't know, I'm not getting candidates of color in these pools. Well, that's not how it works. Right? You have to fill your pools. And I'm telling you, people are out there. I've never had that struggle. We have been able to diversify our principal ranks, our senior leadership team ranks, which was incredibly important to me as a leader. But it
so wait, hold on. I'm gonna jump in a little bit here, though. So I'm hearing two things, Greg. On one hand, you're saying it takes leaders of color to recruit leaders of color, right? That's part of what you said. But Jen, I'm hearing you as a white woman, right? You're saying you were able to do it. So,
so let me tell you a little bit about that. I think that, Jen has courage. Jen is willing to set herself aside and even her white privilege aside to say, I know that we have an issue with diversification. So let me get out of my comfort zone and let me push to get people who don't look like me into some of these top positions. And it is going to take intentional efforts for people like Jen to do that. Our superintendency and our boards across this country are predominantly white. So it's going to require people to own up to their white privilege and to kind of put themselves in discomfort and begin to intentionally recruit. So what I heard Jen talking about was intentionality and really trying to take herself out of her norms and her normal world and say, hey, I got to go figure out who are people not like me who have the same talent, right? Because, there are three things that come regardless of what color you are: vision, integrity, and passion. I always say VIP are the top three things for me, right? Vision, integrity, and passion. You can be any color and possess those, but you have to be willing to go out, like Jen has when she was superintendent, who was an exemplar, let me tell you, as a superintendent across this country. She was intentional about going out and seeking for that.
Right. So Jen, does that ring true?
It does ring true, and not the part about the exemplar. I've made plenty of mistakes, and lots of people will remind me.
Own it.
And I think what my point is yes, leaders of color need to be recruiting more leaders of color, and the movement will build. And white leaders have to get out of their comfort zones. It takes work. It takes building a new sort of network, right? Which gets to Greg's point, right? If you're building your network and expanding the talented leaders and future leaders of color, right, that will fill these pools, then it starts to feed itself. Mm-hmm. And I think I would add to that, I learned so much about building teams, but I learned just as much, and I think the hard way, about retaining leaders of color, about building organizations where leaders of color want to stay, right? How, as a white person, you use your privilege to empower future leaders and leaders of color, how you give up your own power, how you take risks, and sometimes, unfortunately, we have to protect and defend leaders of color, which we don't do enough of.
I'm hearing direct, like a very deliberate kind of approach to saying it's not just enough to say it's important. Like you actually have to be pretty intentional about how you go about it as a white person hiring, right? Yeah. And then I think it probably fits for leaders of all colors, of all stripes, to say, well, what am I doing to retain good talent? In particular, what am I doing to make sure that my leaders of color feel comfortable in staying? I will tell you, I had an issue when I was in Montgomery County. We did a really, really good job of promoting leaders of color, but many times there wasn't any place else for them to go in the organization. So a job doesn't open up. Another district poaches. Yeah. Like, oh, there's a really good, director. I need an assistant superintendent. I'm like, well, I can't just create assistant superintendent jobs. So all of a sudden they're going somewhere else to be an assistant sup, which, on one hand is great because you develop people who go on to do great work. But retention becomes a critical piece. Yeah.
Jen, she just mentioned though about how if you can find a way to support, and then you also mentioned how do you not only support but also defend. This, when you begin to support and defend people of color, they'll stay in that principalship and work for you until that position opens up, right? And the reason why they'll do that, and this is I think the challenge that a lot of, particularly our white boards and white superintendents, I think this is some of the things that they're lacking. They don't understand at time that when people of color and leadership roles are attacked, sometimes people are being attacked because of the color of their skin. It has nothing to do with their skill set. And we get sucked into that we begin to believe what the community says. And now that person becomes a bad person who, if they had a different color of skin, they would be a superhero. Right? And it's like, so you have to be able to really divide, those two things. Have they made a bad or immoral decision? Or is this just white privilege actually coming to surface, and people are trying to discredit that particular leader of color because they don't like the direction that that they may be going into? And that takes a lot of courage for for white leaders and white boards to be able to do that. One thing that I'm fortunate to have is, and our board is predominantly, it's almost 50-50. It's a non-member board of white and Black and Hispanic. But I'm fortunate to have unanimously the support of our board, who are willing to defend me and can see through some of the emails that might come through that are pretty much racist. And I mean, they're just flat out I don't know any other word to say. They were flat out racist.
So we're gonna get to the board in a minute, but I wanna sort of pull this thread a little bit. So hiring people of color is certainly really important, whether you're white, whether you're not, right? One of the challenges, though, we found in the survey is that some folks don't even think it's that important to talk about issues of diversity, to talk about race. We didn't even mention white privilege and white supremacy and all those kinds of things. I'm sure both of you will. But some folks don't even think it is that important, or they don't feel that it's something they're well equipped to do, right? So, again, having a leader that understands the need to diversify their team, that's one thing. It's necessary, not sufficient. How are we going to get more superintendents to understand that you cannot be leading if you're not addressing these issues in some way, shape, or form? Understanding local context, of course, can sometimes dictate how you do that. What do we do about that? Like, what does leadership development look like in that? Jen, we'll start with you on that, because Greg had done it first.
I really want to talk about that, Josh, and I have to just stay on the
You're going to answer the question you want to answer. That's the superintendent.
I'm not trying to avoid it. I just need to punctuate what Greg just said, because I've seen it so many times. Leaders of color who are under a microscope that just would never be scrutinized, right, in that way if they were white leaders. And I love what you said, Greg, being able to talk with your leadership team, your board, and anticipate that, right? Like, this is what it sounds like, looks like, sounds like, feels like, when white supremacy, right, is in action. And in this example, overly scrutinizing a leader of color because they're pushing for change. Like, I think this is part of what it looks like, Josh, like just us learning how to be more explicit, right, and descriptive, and to stop just using language of equity and diversity and inclusion, but to really talk about how racism manifests itself, and to I don't know if we can always do this in a loving and caring way, but in a supportive way, right, in a way where we're learning together about how to name it when we see it, right? So that, so that we can move on. I think that's in part how it looks.
So I imagine that some folks are just, that they don't know how to do it in an inviting way. They don't know how to do it in a supportive, loving way, even if sometimes you just need to call it out, right? But they don't have the skills to know how to invite people into the conversation. So instead you just kind of avoid it because, you want to avoid conflict. I don't know, Greg, is that why people don't talk about it?
I think that's one of the reasons why people don't talk about it. I mean, it makes you uncomfortable, right? Yeah. And one thing that I tell our staff as well as our community, nobody has the right to be comfortable. So you don't have a right to be comfortable. I'm uncomfortable every day as a Black man in America, so deal with it. You got to figure out how we're going to work through this. And I think we need to stop sugarcoating everything and making people feel comfortable, because it's not a comfortable topic. So let's just be honest that it is going to you're going to have to lean into your discomfort. I also think, as you're talking about the professional learning component, we have to start with the historical context. When you get to talk about our history in regards to race, even just talking about the construct of race, it will allow people to see the similarities from 300 years ago to now, and just, what the world is today. And I think that is how you can really get to start the conversation, because we're repeating history continuously because we're not willing to really address the past. And I think that's where you really need to start. And if you're going on this journey, being an anti-racist or an anti-racist school or anti-racist school division, you're going to have to talk about your historical context.
You've been doing that in Alexandria, Greg, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on. Like, you've actually been pushing on that in Alexandria and getting folks to be thinking about the history, right? Talk a little bit about how you approach that.
We have, first and foremost, people say, well, how do we have racism in Alexandria when we're so diverse? And I say, I live right down the street from Duke Street, where we had the largest slave trade in America, in Alexandria. So how can we are born and bred racism in this city. So if you think it doesn't exist, then you're wrong, because it was bred here. And it's still here. The slave trade center is still here. It's still brick and mortar, still here, right? And I try to bring that up all the time. I think the advantage I have in Alexandria is that I'm from here. This is my hometown.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
I constantly tell people, you ran all the other superintendents off, but you can't kick me out of you can't kick me out of my house. And I'm a product of a school system. So you can come at me all you want. I have firsthand experience as a student. I was born in this city, and I'm going to be buried in this city. So even when I'm not superintendent, I'm still going to be buried right here in Alexandria. This is my hometown, right? And I feel that I have an advantage, but I hope other people will have the same kind of courage to begin to talk about, their historical context. We use the book Building the Federal Schoolhouse in Alexandria. It's a book written by Doug Reed, and it talks about our history in Alexandria City Public Schools. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It goes through the whole segregation to how we integrated, to the fact that, we named our only high school after the biggest segregationist and bigot in the country. That led to us changing the name of T.C. Williams because people got the history. Once they had the history, we didn't have to do a petition to try to change the name. It was easy. We had really not a whole lot of opposition about changing the name once we educated people on who Thomas Chambliss Williams was, who said, over my dead body will we have Black and brown children with their white counterparts in school.
Yeah, but all right.
That's how we got it started.
So Greg, and I just want to push you a little bit on this, right? Because I want to know more explicitly. So I love the history. I did that when I was in Stanford, right? I went back into historical documents from the 60s, and I'm like, I'm not just this crazy new guy. Like, there's a history and legacy here we got to undo. But, right, that's history. And a lot of people are like, oh, wait a second, but don't you remember, Jamal, who was valedictorian last year, and he's a great kid, and he's going to Harvard, or, we have kids, we have all these Black and Latino kids who are doing well now, and that's historic, that's history, but we don't do that anymore because we all live together, and blah, blah, blah. So how do you go from the historical examples, say, no, here are the actual examples in our schools right now, other than the names?
Most people's history is not with the Hispanic valedictorian and our Black people growing up to do great things. Everybody still have academic disparities right now. So what we're able to do is then we use what we call a data workbook. We pulled our data workbook to drive our strategic planning work to be very explicit around the academic disparities, the disproportionality that's happening within our school divisions, the practices that are actually perpetuating some of these disproportionalities. So then we can tie, okay, we started this tag program in the city of Alexandria in the late 60s, early 70s, because white people wanted their kids taken out of the general population. We go into 2021, and guess what? Majority of our white kids are in tag, and they're being pulled out of the general population. Let's talk about this correlation here, folks. This was our history 50 years ago. It's still happening today. Let's talk about it, right?
You got to draw that line.
You got to draw that line. You have to actually bring those connections in, because people, the lay person is not going to really understand that until you bring it to them. Mm-hmm. Like I always say, you can take a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. But guess what? If you give the horse salt, he or she will drink. People don't know that. Salt will make the horse drink the water. Well, guess what? We got to bring salt into the picture, and that is data, making the connections so that people can't avoid it any longer. It forces you to have to now take action. And when you do it publicly, how can you not do something about it?
So Jen, when you were in Madison, you were very clear. You started Black Excellence Agenda, right? You were very, very clear. You said, no, this is really important. Was it? I mean, to talk a little bit about that strategy, how you led that in Madison, which is different than Alexandria.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, this conversation is really resonating for me. Like how important it is to create spaces for people to understand their history, their local history in depth, themselves in relationship to that local history, and then how it's playing out in strategy. Because it's not about blame, right? We're just trying to seek understanding of this world that we live in so that we can make it better, that there's like perseverance in it, right? Like we just have to, the conversation never ends. It's not something you do once and you're done. And I say that because in Madison, our focus on Black excellence, we didn't start there, right? That was 5 years in to the work, right? And it sort of emanated, right, from our the lessons that we mined from our successes and failures. Like we just kept trying to understand what our real goals were. We just kept trying to understand what the real problems were that stood in the way of those goals, and we kept kind of learning through this really messy work. And it was really mainly through the disciplined practices, which included learning how better to center the voices of students of color, Black students in particular in the district. We learned how to listen to them more attentively. And over time, Josh, they've been saying this all along. Our students have been telling us what they wanted all along. We finally were in a place where we had learned enough together that we could actually hear them and make sense out of it. But what our students were telling us was that the problem wasn't the achievement gap, right? The problem wasn't that they needed more and more reading and math intervention, though some might have needed that too, but they needed for us to see their brilliance and cultivate it. They wanted to be challenged intellectually. They wanted to interrogate the world around them and make it better. They wanted safe places so that they wouldn't internalize all the racist crap that they were dealing with day after day. And it changed the way over time, it changed the way we thought about the work. That, wow, maybe the way we actually had started 5 years ago, our focus on achievement gap and fidelity to the curriculum and intervention, while I don't want to dismiss those things, right? They're not necessarily bad, but those things by themselves are actually harming students more than they were helping them. We were constrained in our possibilities. So like the concept of Black excellence, which again emerged, it wasn't like an initiative or a strategy. It was a way of reframing the work and what was possible. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. And there's something I want to tease out a little bit as I move into something else, but it also, I'm just thinking, hearing both of what you both said, like there's a credibility factor, right? And Greg, you as the hometown guy who comes back into the system as an experienced, successful superintendent, you have immediate credibility there. Jen, you had to build some up. Right, you were new in Madison, so it timing always matters, right? And you may not have been able to start with the Black Excellence Agenda. Maybe you could have, but it might have been harder to start, whereas you built to it. Whereas Greg, I wonder if you had some credibility coming in, you could say, "Hey guys, we got to do this," because you would know the community, you have people there already, and they know you, right? I just wonder. How you develop credibility becomes a question.
I think I would have more credibility to some people in this community if I didn't look the way I looked, right? I get negative points for my credibility because I'm Black. So I come in and I have a Black wife and we have 2 Black children. Right? So,
is it because people think that's the only thing you care about?
So they look at me and then my credibility goes away for many people, right? No matter how much experience I have. And the unfortunate thing is that, if I looked a little differently, I probably could move faster than I am right now. People can't get past the way I look. In our school division is actually predominantly Hispanic. And a lot of people didn't even know that until I got here. Because I started saying, like, everybody, we keep talking about Black, but our largest population is Hispanic, and our hugest achievement gap is between our Hispanic students and their white counterparts. Our Black students, they're graduating above 90%. Our Hispanic students are below 70%. That's our issue. And for the first time at our first leadership team meeting in August of 2018, a month after I arrived, that was the first time the leaders had that discussion. I'm like, well, it's right here. Like they had an aha moment, an epiphany at that moment. And that was the first time we started talking about our Hispanic achievement gap. So, and I'm not Hispanic and I don't speak Spanish. But people they make that assumption because of my color. All I care about is Black children, and all I can serve are Black children. And not everybody thinks that way, but many in our community.
Well, that's the risk you run, right? When you're the superintendent of color. I remember Paul Vance, who was the first Black superintendent in Montgomery County. He used to talk about that to me all the time. He was like, look, they thought that I was going to be the savior, but what folks didn't understand is I had to keep the white people happy, right, as the Black male superintendent. And I couldn't go too far to support the Black and brown kids because that's what they expected me to do, right? I'm hearing you say something similar, but I'm also kind of curious, Greg, about how you make that historical connection then, which is grounded where you talk about having the slave auction in Alexandria and all that, but then you're talking Hispanic kids and Latinx kids, which may be a little newer. So is it the same argument? Is it a different argument? Is it a more nuanced argument?
I think it's the same in some ways because it's still talking about the fact of oppression is really how we relate that. And, because we have a high immigrant population, we begin to talk about democracy, and how they deserve a right to be a part of our community. And because we have a high Hispanic population, we're now bringing more Hispanic educators. We don't have a problem with Black educators. We have a problem with Hispanic educators and people who are bilingual. People now that I've hired, I'm looking for people who speak Spanish and that are in our Julia Burgos, our chief of school and community relations, a job that we created. She's now and a Latina. She's now able to now have a voice. They have a seat at the table, right? And that is like putting your action into words, and that's really how we're trying to tie those two. But it's a hard juggle, just trying to navigate this whole racial kind of like divide that everybody tries to avoid. It's hard to really bring it to the top of the list and to try to have people kind of tap into their own biases and racist tendencies that we all have for many different reasons, right? But having to look in the mirror and say, I'm a racist. Everybody has to do it. They got to look in the mirror and say, I'm a racist, and I need to figure out how I'm going to become an anti-racist.
So let's talk about the conflict and the politics of that, right? Because a lot of superintendents, they may not be well equipped to have these conversations. They may not believe that they should look in the mirror and say that. A lot, and the thing, white superintendents, some Black superintendents and Latino superintendents might think, I don't want to be only thought about that way, right? As you were describing, Greg, right? Or they may be thinking, I got a board, because care and feeding of the board is one of the major issues that superintendents have, or I got teachers or parents that don't want to accept this. So you're going to run into conflict if you bring if you bring this into larger conversation. So how do you deal with politics, and how do you deal with the inevitable conflict and pushback that's going to come if you are pushing an anti-racist agenda, an allyship agenda, a culturally responsive agenda? And notice I'm using different language, right? How do you manage the politics, and what do you do about the conflict?
I'll start on that. Wow, that's such a big question. Gosh, your questions are.
I was going to say 25 words or less. But yeah.
I know. I mean, context matters a lot. I think that's what we were just pointing to. I honestly don't think that a Black superintendent could have centered Black excellence in Madison to start. And our team has talked about this. They needed me to do it, right? And of course I wanted to. We were in it together, but I think that's important to name. And there is a Black superintendent now in Madison who is able to take that agenda and purpose and move it forward in powerful ways, which I don't think I could have done, right? There's something about the intentionality of when to pass the baton and to whom, which maybe brings us back to our first conversation about leadership development, that I just need to name for a second. But this issue of context matters a lot. I mean, you need to know who you're working with. You need to find your allies. You need to build deep, not only understanding of your community and its history, but relationships with one another. I mean, the amount of time that I spent as a leader just building trust, right, especially across racial lines, I mean, was significant. Mm-hmm. I did a lot of really intentional work with my board to build up their kind of muscle and leadership capacity to talk about issues of racism, racial equity that they couldn't have done before, right? Like it took time and practice, especially when you're always in the public spotlight with reporters sitting in the room, writing down everything you say, right? I mean, we're asking our board members to take some pretty big risks, right? When we know what some of the backlash can look like. So, I mean, I just think it's really multifaceted. I think I don't know, support networks, you got to know, like it gets hard. I mean, even as a white leader, right? I've gotten more hate mail than I can count. I mean, it's just, endless. And yet I knew that for the most part, I was going to wake up the next morning and be able to walk right back in the office every day, right? That was the privilege that came with it. I don't know, Greg, what do you have to say about this?
I mean, I think everything that you have said is spot on. This is one of the reasons why I'm actually writing a book right now, Causing Good Trouble in Public Schools. And it's a guide to becoming an anti-racist school or school division. I'm doing it for this very reason. There's not a lot of resources out there to help you navigate this, right? So I'm trying to give our future leaders, our current leaders, a guide to navigate, right? Because this work, I mean, it is so huge that you have to accept the fact you're going to be walking into a fire. You're pretty much walking into a fire with no equipment. You're not going to have a face mask. You're going to have to figure out how to still breathe in this fire, that's blazing. And you are risking your reputation, you're risking your career. It's all on the line. And you have to believe it that much that you're willing to do those things in order to actually see the needle move. And what we have to do, it goes back to the professional learning piece that you talked about earlier. How do you build up future leaders who are going to be courageous and bold enough to do that, right? How are you going to be bold enough to go out and do that? It's kind of like to have the audacity to say, I'm going to dismantle systemic racism, and I'm going to tell you this publicly, and I'm going to take actions to do it in spite of what you do to me, in spite of what you say about me, in spite of what you try to do to me, right? I'm still going to persevere and make it. And you got to be nuts, one, to do it, to even get to that point, right? And I'm glad I'm nuts because I'm willing to put myself out there to do it unapologetically. But if you don't have that foundation, and if you're not able to get up and dust yourself off and, go at it again the next day, it's never going to work. You're going to give up. You're going to give up.
This is where I struggle, right? Because on one hand, I remember what Rudy Crew used to always say, you're going to get fired, so choose what you're going to get fired over, right? And I get what you're saying, Greg, around being nuts and all that. And I agree with that. But at what point does it just become the norm, right? At what point it's just expected that if you're the superintendent of schools, if you have that privilege to serve a community in that way, you are going to address issues of equity and social justice, and you are going to have the skills, right? You're going to read Greg's book and apply there's a lot of really interesting things you guys are saying here, right? You're saying context matters, right? Knowing yourself and what is important to you and what you can do to pull people along and push people, right? You look at the data, right? And look at your history. There's some really very intentional, deliberate actions you all are describing here, but I don't want it to be something where you got to be nuts, right? I want it to be the norm.
That's right. But Josh, in order for it to be the norm, our federal government has to say this is the norm.
Yeah.
And hopefully the Biden administration will come out and be bold enough to
Mm.
say it, right? This is the norm. The expectation is that we narrow this achievement gap and we see not little small increments of narrowing the achievement gap. We need some bold action to do that. And it starts with how we're assessing our kids. I keep going back and forth and I hate to bring it up, but the whole assessment component, I still feel like there's some issues with that and how we're assessing kids and why we're assessing kids and what we're doing with that data, because we're still using things that are not, racially, I think, balanced, for our students. And that to me is all we're starting off at a disservice. So we're instantly putting Black and brown kids at a disadvantage with the assessment tools that we're using on them, where we have brilliant people who may just be in certain circumstances, but they're not able to express or show what they actually do and the potential they do have. Until our country does that, I don't think anybody's going to make it a priority and it's going to be a norm. As long as the country's not saying this is a requirement, this is what we stand for.
So have you seen anybody, and specifically, like specific actions, and then are there any resources that you would encourage other superintendents to start with, right? Like we make the road by walking. There's no one path. Once Greg's book is out, that'll be the Bible. Where do you even start? So there's two questions wrapped up in one, but who wants to start with that? Good examples of people out there.
I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think that I'll say that the districts that stand out in my mind are not just making statements, right, about, Black Lives Mattering or doing professional development with their teachers. These are places that are thinking about systems, right, and how to re-examine every component, right, of where their school system works with a racial equity lens. They're looking at their HR systems. They're looking at the way resources are allocated. They're looking at how they communicate, all of it, right? Everything. So when I think about that, like who's thinking about the work in that way, right? They're not trying to just burn the house down. They're trying to like methodically rebuild, right, with a racial equity lens. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what's been happening in Oakland over years. I think they have a really interesting, not just interesting, inspiring way of thinking about the work. It goes back to when Tony Smith was the superintendent there and maybe even before him, moving forward. There's a tradition there of seeing the work in a systemic way that is deeply embedded in community voices and kind of hopes and dreams, right? Like there's an Oakland tradition, right, of Black excellence that is building on. So I would encourage people to look there. I'm very impressed with Chicago. I love the work that Janice Jackson and her team are doing. Morris Sweeney, who's the equity officer there now, I think is outstanding. And I think if you go on their website, you'll see it'd be interesting for everybody to look at their equity tool. I'm not exactly sure what it's called off the top of my head, but
equity tool is fine.
Yeah, it's powerful, I think, and actually represents the real work that's happening in Chicago. Again, I think they're taking this systems view, right, interrogating everything that they do with an equity lens, and of course, a very strong focus on instruction. And I've got my eye on Atlanta right now for the same reasons. This, Josh, because I'm the co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project, we wrote a note on racial equity that I'm happy to share that kind of lays out some thinking about how to do this work from a systems point of view. So I'll offer that. But there aren't enough examples, right? There aren't enough.
Greg, what are you seeing?
Sorry, I was going to say, I think I say second to what Jenna said, but I have some other people I want to add to that. Dr. Sharon Contreras and her work that she's doing in Guilford County. She was amazing in Syracuse doing the work, reducing the school to prison pipeline work, and that she took into Guilford County. And you talk about a woman, a person of color, and someone with a disability. She's lost 90% of her hearing, and that has not stopped her from doing her work. She's amazing, and also was almost tapped to be the U.S. Secretary of Education. right? At least she was in the making for it, which shame on them for not appointing her. I'm not putting down the person they appointed. I'm just saying, Dr. Shan Contreras, she was awesome. Dr. Lavelle Brown, he's doing his work in Ithaca, a lot of work in regards to cultivating love. He's written a book about it, and just his equity and transformation work that he's doing is very powerful. He's now on the circuit all over, talking all over the nation about equity in schools. And then, I think somebody who's a trailblazer that a lot of people just don't know about quite yet is Dr. Talisa Dixon. She's the superintendent of Columbus City Schools in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And she is doing a remarkable job with turning around a school division where majority of the students were failing. It was no way but up for her when she took on this role. And she is already setting a foundation. Unfortunately, COVID has happened, but she's still working in spite of COVID to continue, this work to rise the achievement gap. I'm sorry, to decline, the achievement gap, not rise it. And there's some powerful work happening in Columbus as well. And these are all superintendents of color that I'm talking about, right? Yeah. And they are doing some powerful things that unfortunately, a lot of times people just don't get the same recognition. And I know it has something to do with the color of their skin a lot of times, or them being a woman. It doesn't get them at the top of that list. So
that's going to be that is a great plug for our next podcast, which we're doing about women in leadership, because that continues to be an issue that we see in the AASA Decennial Survey. But before I let you go, I just kind of one short answer question for the two of you. And I did not preview this for you, so I'm going to maybe catch you off guard a little bit. But what is the most joy that you have taken from leading the conversation on race? Like, where's the joy in it?
Do you want to go first, Greg, or do you want me to go?
You can go first, Jen.
I feel like there's been a lot of joy in it, Josh. It's such an interesting question, and pain too. I mean, like all of it. But the joy has come mainly from, I don't know, there's some freedom in it. And I don't know how to put into better words than that. Like getting to kind of own up, right, to our racist history, to make peace to some extent with, especially for white folk, like how we've been raised and the things we've seen and heard and done, and to take action, right, to make change, even if we're floundering along the way. I think there's a lot of beauty and joy in that. Freedom in it.
Yeah. Great.
I think there's a lot of joy in the action. Also, the joy for me, when I hear especially our students of color say, you see me and you hear me and you get me, right? That right there says it's worth it. It's worth the nasty emails. It's worth the criticism. Yeah. It's worth the horrible op-eds that people write to try to discredit, anybody who's trying to tackle systemic racism. I think that's the biggest joy. They're the next generation. And just for them knowing that somebody is going above and beyond the call of duty and relentlessly working to remove barriers, I mean, that right there, that brings the joy. It makes it worth it. That's the only way I get up every day. I got to keep reminding myself about the young people who are being impacted. Adults, they make this work hard, honestly. I don't do the work for the adults. I really don't. Adults are not going to make me want to get up and come to work. Adults make me angry sometimes. The kids, that is what, even the kids who have challenges, because it's an adult that caused them to act the way they act right now. A lot of times we put it on the kids. It's an adult that caused some of that. Right? But the kids are why we do this work, why we said we wanted to go into education, why we are relentlessly doing everything that we possibly can. So that's what brings me to joy.
All right. Well, because thank you both. And I always want to, as you describe the work, and as I know from doing the work, it's hard. You get beat up. It's sometimes you just feel like you don't know what you're doing, or you're just getting attacked for the wrong reasons, or whatever it may be. But there is joy in the work. And that's one of the things we want to continue to do with this series, is highlight that even though it's hard, you can have joy. So I appreciate that from both of you. So I want to offer 2 resources for folks out there. and there's so many of them, but two pieces that have grounded me as I've explored this. James Baldwin's Talk to Teachers, his great 1963 speech. I read it at least once a year. And then Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just two places to start. Just, you know, and of course, Ibram Kendi's book, It's Stamped in Between, but just to start on your journey. So Dr. Greg Hutchings, Superintendent of Alexandria, Dr. Jen Cheatham, Professor of Practice at Harvard and former Superintendent of Madison, Wisconsin. I thank you both for the inaugural AASA Decennial Survey podcast series. I appreciate you taking the time to join me today. And for the rest of you out there, please stay tuned as we continue to engage in what I hope are thoughtful and fun and enlightening and educative conversations with some of the great education leaders in our country. So I'm Josh Starr, CEO of PDK. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the AASA PDK Decennial podcast series. If you would like to purchase a copy of the AASA Decennial Report, please access links.aasa.org/decennial for more information.